Hello everyone, it's me, Janky P, coming in with a new video on a Wednesday. This one is going to be a bit wordy. I've done my blooming fact checking this time. What I'm going to present today is one strand of my research. So for those of you that don't know, at least for the last 8 years, this particular strand for the last 2, I research kind of how magic is used as a tool of resistance, or we could say the intersections of magic and radical political praxis. For people not in the esoteric world, they might be like, what is that? So there's classic definitions of magic, you know, developing from Crowley. I prefer like Starhawk and Dion Fortune's definition, which is magic, the art of changing consciousness at will. Still is a little bit esoteric, very individualized, so let's maybe think of it as magical practice. What might that involve? Well, visionary and ecstatic experiences, connections with the other world, you know, through dreams, divination, ritual, potentially like entheogenic or like psychedelic experiences, or at least use of herbs as well like collective trance and ecstasy. Now, historically, when there's been kind of lots of, you know, famine or a change in the social system, these kind of practices, there's always quite an explosion. And these practices, I forgot to say, sometimes it might be referred to as shamanism or shamanism, as I would say. I've noticed actually I wildly mispronounce everything, but let's just go with it. So in some cultures it's known as shamanism, maybe spirit work, visions of the divine. I feel these kind of like linguistic differences. It's mostly kind of like the colonizing practices of academia. All of these different practices, you know, they're not the same. They're culturally situated and mixed in with local like symbolism, the social structure. And I'm not saying all practices like the other world is the same, but there's similar practices which have been used. Now I'll look at it from a kind of like anarchist, feminist, decolonial perspective, or at least that's what I strive to, and looking at how such practices have been used, you know, in, for example, rebellions of the enslaved, or what we're going to look at today is the European Inquisition and the witch hunts, so looking at peasants of the Middle Ages and also like heretics. So as I said, this is one strand of my research, and I look at both historical and contemporary cases. So I'd like to say I go anti-clockwise around the Atlantic, but if we're looking from a linear historical perspective, it's the other way around. So starting with the European Inquisition, then how these ideas are exported to the colonies and mixed in with categories of race, so they take on a far more insidious and hideous form. But so I'm also very interested in the Haitian Revolution, because it's, you know, this first, I don't want to say only, but the first successful uprising of the enslaved black working class people, in which voodoo played a significant role, and like social organisation and other things. And as well, so I do a master's, I'm in my 7th semester, maybe even 8th semester of a master's in North American studies, which basically I kind of like find any way in to look at like magical practice. So also looking at the contemporary situation in the United States, where, I mean, it's fucking shit. Today is election day, it's a fucking shit show. Always has been. People say, why do you study North America? I'm like, oh, it's fun to watch an empire crumble. Now I kind of regret saying that. But anyway, there's a lot of exciting stuff in terms of like the magical resistance in the United States, especially like from the anti-racist, decolonizing, dismantling white supremacist means. So, also interested in how these kind of like animistic, pagan cosmologies kind of, you know, they have some kind of answers, or they present possibilities of other ways of living, also challenging like the concept of the self-bounded, isolated individual, which is so necessary for the capitalist system in which we live today. And so that's it. So get ready. We're going to delve into the Inquisition times, and I hope you are ready to learn some stuff. Oh gosh. Also, I forgot to add, so I am no expert on this stuff. I was supposed to present this research at like this magical occult academic conference, Essigen, which would have been at the University of Amsterdam, but blooming Corona got it cancelled. So I'm no expert on this, so if anyone somehow was watching that knows more, I invite you to critique or pose further questions if you have any like recommendations of what I want to read. Basically, I just really want to talk to people about magic. It's lockdown. How am I going to achieve this? Here. So I hope you enjoy. Let's dive in. In my opinion, any study, especially a radical study of the witch hunts and the Inquisition, should start with this very great text, Caliban on the Witch from Silvia Federici. I came across this book. It's not where my studies of witchcraft started, but I was very happy to discover it. I came across it when I was doing a course called The Witch, Magic and Resistance in the 20th Century with the occult poet and scholar Shafra McSherry. In this course we looked at a lot of like female figures who might be considered witches. So there was Leonora Carrington, Audre Lorde, Ursula Le Guin, Dion Fortune, Zora Neale Hurston, Catherine Dunham, Tituba, Toni Morrison, all the legends, and 1 week on Federici. So I was excited to find this book because it was, well, I don't want to say the final piece of the puzzle because it raised so many more questions, which is what we're going to look at today, but it tied many things together. And so what I have done with my research is, as I call it, following the threads of Federici. There's a few issues here that I feel that could take more development, give it a bit of ethnographic flavour. So that's what we'll do today. But what does Federici say? Why is this text so important? So Silvia Federici, Italian Marxist feminist historian, scholar, she was instrumental in the 1970s of the wages for housework movement. So like a revaluation of women's labour and their role in like reproducing the workforce. So in terms of the witch hunt, what does Federici say? So important. So what she says is the witch hunts, the Inquisition, normally it's presented as, a product of Catholic, medieval, middle-age superstition. But what she says is it wasn't just, as she refers to it, the dying last spark of a feudal world of Catholic superstition. In fact, it was a political initiative, one sponsored by the state and instrumental to the advent of capitalism, this transition between feudalism to capitalism. So what did it do? So in the terms of primitive accumulation, it contributes to domesticating independent women and helping to introduce the sexual division of labour, where, to put it basically, if you imagine, the woman stays at home and does the reproductive labour of attending to the workers of the world, feeding them, clothing them, all this kind of domestic stuff, whereas the men would go out and work. And this is what she refers to as the patriarchy of the wage. So yeah, normally it seems like Catholic superstition, or for example like the foolish peasantry. But when we look at it as a state initiative, then we can start to ask the questions like, what were the socio-economic benefits of burning thousands of women in this period of time? So the witch hunts were from about the 14th century till up until the end of the 17th century, I would say. I'm really bad talking about centuries, so like 1400s till the late 1600s. And so, yeah, when we look at a state-sponsored initiative, who benefited and why? And so when we ask these questions, we can also kind of look at like what was destroyed to get to where we are today. And by doing so, we see it was a political initiative And looking further behind the scenes, we see that it was a class war carried out by other means. So mostly targeted were poor peasant women, men too, and also like in the witch hunt, it went across Europe, so each country had kind of different responses and different things happened. But so in some areas, I think it was in Germany that upper classes were also challenged, but more often than not, they could like pay their way, and it was essentially a class war by other means. And it's important to look at this history, the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and look at kind of the bloody, genocidal means in which it was introduced. Then, it challenges this narrative that it was, the inevitable transition, the inevitable development of society. And as Marx says, this is, I can never get this quote right, this history of expropriation was written in the annals of mankind in letters of blood and fire. So when we see that, when we see kind of the real way it had to be forced upon people, communities destroyed, whole cosmologies and experiences devalued, when we look at from this perspective, then maybe we can open up other ideas of it doesn't have to be this way. So this is also why I'm interested in looking at what was destroyed to get to where we are today, because maybe we're going to talk about this later. We shouldn't over-romanticize the pre-capitalist world either, but maybe there are some kernels there that can help us get out of this mess. So Federici as well, in terms of like the Marxist tradition or like Marxist theoretical tradition, she was radical in the sense that Marx's analysis of primitive accumulation was always focused on the white proletarian male's experience, whereas Federici, and this is her continuing a conversation that's been started or like involves like Starhawk, Maria Mies, Caroline Merchant as well, but so she's like, actually, let's not have a white male proletariat centric view. Let's look at the female or the feminine experience as well. So this is the women's history of primitive accumulation. And also she's radical because she also links it with then what then happened in the colonies. So like what happened in Europe, the means of torture, of these kind of juridical processes of diabolicizing certain people of the population were then exported to the colonies, linked with hierarchies of race, and as I said, took an even more insidious form. But it's important to draw these connections around the Atlantic as well. We don't want to fall into the traps of white feminism or the kind of essentializing discourses of white witches. So this is why Federici is a great starting point. But also, I am a witch. I'm not a Marxist. I am a mystical anarchist, if we're going to put it in concrete terms. So there are some limits of the purely materialistic perspective, especially when you researching magic. So I feel like this is where my research comes in, is trying. As soon as I did some sort of magic things with my hands, my storage was full. So what I was saying, I feel like my research, I'm following these threads, trying to like tease out the magic or this kind of magical practice, and revaluing again kind of the spiritual encounters in this time as well, which is pretty difficult to do. And also, if you're doing this in the realm of academia, you tend to get like shat upon by snooty materialists. I'm not going to say I subscribe to like the Margaret Murray idea of this mythic matriarchy, although the academic response to Margaret Murray I feel is a continuation of the Inquisition, but basically Margaret Murray looked at testimony from the witch hunts and tried to establish the idea that there was this widespread matriarchy in which women were, I don't want to say rulers, but the women's experience was central to the social organisation. And this has been heavily critiqued, partly because what people said in the witch hunts doesn't necessarily reflect their actual activities. Also, Carlo Ginzburg has done some good studies looking at the witch hunts and trying to trace the Sabbat, and also investigating, like, is this a form of like European. Once again, as soon as I started speaking about magic, storage full. But so what I was saying, also Carlo Ginzburg does some interesting work looking at the Sabbat and the kind of practices that were challenged by the Inquisition, and looking at perhaps is this a form of European or Eurasian shamanism. So, with this out the way, let's dive into the transition of feudalism to capitalism, which Federici outlines in Caliban and the Witch. So, the process of primitive accumulation, especially in Europe, one of the main things that happened here was the process of enclosure, which is like the privatization of land, destruction of the commons. So that was one main thing, establishment of private property. It also diabolicized forms of collective assembly, especially those at night. And the main issue here, especially in terms of the witch hunt, it disciplined economically independent women, sexually independent women, and turned them into like domesticated labour. And so Federici, why I like the book, she paints, I don't want to say a very nice history, because this is a history of gendercide, of torture, of people being burnt at the stake. But so her history, she shows and reveals this history of very independent, strong women from like the Middle Ages, which I don't know about your school history classes, but I never really heard about this. She speaks of like women from the 12th to 15th centuries, not the 15th centuries, but so in the feudal era, there were, for example, women bricklayers, there were prostitution for a short time was legalised, you know, they weren't seen as the social pariahs that they later became during the witch hunt. There were female healers, there were female religious leaders, which I never heard about this. Did you learn about women female bricklayers of the Middle Ages? I don't think so. All I learned about was either Henry VIII's wives or like Joan of Arc, which I feel as well she takes more of a mythological status, and the end of this story is that she's dead. I feel is that women's history, the end of the story is that they get burnt alive. So I was interested to learn more. My notes are all over the place. This is what I'm reading from, actually. I'll give you a little peek behind the scenes. This is what I'm reading from, and I'm going to turn it over. So, yeah, what I wanted to do, she paints some pictures and I wanted to find out more while also infusing it with the kind of mystical perspective. And as I said, I am a scholar of social movements, radical rebellions, and so one of the threads of Federici, which we're going to focus on today, there's a few, but so I'd like to start with heretics. So, heretical sects or groups. These were social movements, religious orders, or not orders, but religious groups who challenged the orthodoxy of the Christian church. Now, I didn't know until I was doing this research that the Inquisition wasn't just charged with hunting witches, and in fact, before the witch hunt, so it was led by Dominican monks. First, they were targeting Jewish people and those with leprosy, and then later charged with hunting, burning, getting rid of heretics. And in Federici's history, so these are some of the groups in which women had key leadership roles, and they're also like writing their own texts. So I was very interested in delving more and finding out about these groups. Now, as Federici points out, and as I've already said, the main point of her thesis is that the witch hunts, it wasn't just the Catholic Church, it was a state-sponsored initiative. However, the Catholic Church did provide what she refers to as the ideological scaffold. So in this regard, looking at theological doctrines, these are the kind of dusty tomes written by monks that I was looking at during my time in the States in the Witch Vault. The monks, they were printing a lot of books and they had the networks in which to distribute them. So a lot of these texts are the ones which codify the figure of the witch and present these mostly misogynistic ideas which were used in order to target women. So the theological treatises are quite important, at least until the Reformation. Now there's two key texts I forgot to mention. So in the Inquisition, there was an overlap or a development from hunting heretics to hunting witches, and there are two texts that were crucial in this. One comes from Johannes Nieder, Formicarus, which was in 1436, I want to say, definitely the 1430s. And the second one, which is, the most well-known one, the Hammer of Witches, Malleus Maleficarum, written by the Inquisitor Heinrich Kramer. It's often given a co-author of Spenger, I can't quite remember his name, but it's mostly Kramer, essentially. And so it was these two texts which established the idea of, rather than witchcraft being an individual practice, towards this idea of a witch conspiracy, a group of people operating at night, trying to bring down the Catholic order. Where am I going with this? So yeah, before these texts, witchcraft, there's a text from 1906, the Canon Episcopi, which this was the first time that witchcraft has always been on the church's radar. Let's look at Old Testament, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. But in the Canon Episcopi, this is when ideas of witchcraft practice were then being legitimately debated by theologians. But in the canon, it saw witchcraft more as not a material practice, but something that happened in the spirit realm. So it spoke towards these ideas of, the kind of the wild hunt and Diana and groups of spirits coming at night to take you away. But this was considered, from some perspectives, delusions, or it only took place in fantasy, whereas later on it became seen as a kind of material practice, and as a result you can take an actual person and put them on trial for real crimes as they saw them. And also, so the differentiation between the heretic and the witch, so this introduced a kind of feminization of magic. So in Nieder's text, Formicarus, actually the witches were men, and it was in Kramer's text where he was instrumental in this kind of feminization of magic, where there was a division where heretics were seen as the male, who were, political actors, whereas the women were seen as working for the devil. They were, at the whim of their impulses, doing the work for the devil, and as a result, this kind of discourse robs women of their political agency, which, as we'll see, was not the case. And in a lot of these heretical movements, women were at the forefront. They were leaders, they had their own visionary experiences which were taken quite seriously, and this is why I found them so interesting. However, it's important not to romanticize the heretical sects. They were not all good. And this is why the first one I want to talk about, they're not really to do with the witch hunt, but I find them very interesting, and also it just is a very clear example of why we shouldn't romanticize them. And so first, I'll tell you all the ones we're talking about. So first, we're going to look at the Flagellants, then the Beguines, then the Brethren of the Free Spirit, and then I don't really know so much about them, so I won't go into too much detail, but the Cathars. I feel there's a lot already people talk about them. And then finally, the Valdenses, I think that's how you say it, the Valdensinians, who they were the one group who in all these theological doctrines were the ones who then became witches. All of this with the Valdens was taking place in the Western Alpine region, so linking with like Italy, the Council of Basel in Switzerland, got Nuremberg, so this kind of, I mean, it's a mirror image in the video, but this kind of Western Alpine area is where we're going to end our story, and then we'll get to the Sabbat for reals. So, let's get talking about the blooming Flagellants. So, the Heretics. Most of this information I'm getting from Norman Cohn, two great books, Europe's Inner Demons and The Pursuit of the Millennium. So we're going to look specifically at continental Europe, but so these heretical sects, they were kind of millenarian movements with this kind of apocalyptic ideas of heralding the end times in many cases, or saying that there's an advent of a new era, this age of spirit. A lot of them involved kind of bodily, personal connections with the divine, ecstatic experiences, and as well a lot of them involved a renunciation of wealth. So the sects weren't all the same. Some of them were adopted by the lower classes, others kind of wealthy merchants who did have wealth to renounce. But so a lot of them were wandering groups, so they had alternative forms of social organisation. And as I feel like I've said probably about 10 times, women were preachers in many of them and had key leadership roles. So, the Flagellants, who were they? Probably the most curious group I've encountered, but as I said, quite problematic. So they were groups of Christian men who would travel around towns publicly whipping themselves in like displays of penance. They believed that if they inflicted this kind of grim torture on themselves, then God might spare his whip. They were reported in the 1260s, but really flourished in the times of the plague. So the Black Death was 1348, I want to say, yeah. So this was the time when they flourished. And what did they do? They would move around in groups, which could be 50 people, 500, in some cases 5,000. They would arrive in the town and they would do their ritual, so it was men who were subservient to a master, and they would walk around hitting themselves with like leather scourges with like iron spikes on them, and they had absolute obedience to their leader. They wore pretty freaky looking like white KKK style cloaks like this kind of business, going around in a circle, whipping themselves, and they would wipe up the blood with a rag and say, this is a divine bloody rag, which sounds a little bit horrifying. Well, I don't want to judge people who like pain, but the idea of this kind of hooded procession of people whipping themselves is quite a spectacle. But it seems like the general population were quite favourably disposed to these groups, so people would flock to see them. As I said, they had a lot of recruits. Although there is one part of this history which I find quite funny. So the groups, they moved from Hungary to southern Germany to the Low Countries like France, Brussels, and at one point they got on a boat and went to London. So firstly, I'd just like to imagine these group of hooded guys on a boat. Did they do the ritual on the boat? But they went to London. London wasn't having any of it. Like, these prude British people had no time for these funny continental Europeans whipping themselves. So also I'm thinking, like, what did they do when they went back? Did they just like sit on the boat with the whips between their legs, being a bit like disappointed? So these are the Flagellants. That's what they were doing. But, and this is why they're problematic. So there are connections and links that when they came to town, there would be outbreaks of anti-Semitic violence or massacres. For example, when they were in Brussels, 600 Jewish people were killed. There's some studies which say there's not a direct correlation, but I think it points towards the kind of religious fervour that can be enticed by these radical groups. But as I said, The Flagellants, probably not the nicest group of history. Very interesting to learn about, especially in our current plague era. But now that we've got them out of the way, let's have a look at the Beguines. Okay, for the Beguines, I'm about to read to you what is probably my favourite quote I've encountered in this research so far. So in 1274, an East German bishop complained, "These women were idle, gossiping vagabonds who refuse obedience to men under the pretext that God was best served in freedom." What a burn. Bloody Beguines. Who were they? What were they up to? So the Beguines were religious laywomen who lived in autonomous feminine female communities from about the 1100s to the 1300s. And so they lived in these sisterhoods, and they were economically independent women. They did things like calligraphy, weaving, money changing, healing services. They also provided comfort and shelter to sex workers, and because of their independence, they certainly ruffled a few feathers in the Catholic Church. And actually in 1298 there was a papal bull saying that female religiosity needs to have solemn vows or cloistering. Also back in these days, a lot of kind of religious women who were part of the Catholic Church used to live in communities where they were like bricked up, which is pretty intense, but not the Beguines. They were independent women. And so the word Beguine kind of became synonymous or like a slur with prostitute, which is normally how these kind of misogynistic trends go. But actually they're quite pious women, and what they kind of preached or what they practiced was quite a mystical and bodily erotic connection with the divine. What does it say? They wanted a passionate desire for intense mystical experience. And I feel this kind of ideas are best encapsulated in the work of Marguerite Porete. I think that's how you say your name. So she was a Beguine, and she wrote a book that is known as The Mirror of Simple Souls. That's the shorthand. The full name, let me read this. The Mirror of Simple Annihilated Souls and Those Who Only Remain in Will and Desire of Love. So it's quite the title. Written by a woman and became a seminal text for a movement we're going to talk about next, the movement of the free spirit. Yeah, so The Mirror of Simple Souls. I must admit, I've not had the chance to read the full text yet, but I definitely would like to. I'm pretty sure it's free online. But so The Mirror of Simple Souls is presented as dialogue, like a lot of these middle-aged texts were. So a dialogue between love, reason and soul, in which a state of mystical union in which will completely loses itself with God and becomes undifferentiated. Now, I feel this kind of idea of divinity and mystical religious experience is very different to that in which, a connection with the divine which is mediated by the Catholic Church. Instead, these ideas, to me, sounds like this kind of idea of there's a divine spark within and you have the tools inside yourself in order to have these experiences, connect with the divine. What these kind of ideas will turn into and how they are put into practice, we will see with the movement of the free spirit. But so Marguerite Porete, author of this text, burnt in 1310 in France. It's quite a sad thing, and eventually the Beguines were deemed heretical by the Catholic Church and forced to go underground. So, as I said earlier, the Beguines were quite pious women. As I said, the term became synonymous with prostitution, but they were pious women. But not all Beguines. These were women they were based in Germany, a lot in what is known as the Low Countries, which are things like Belgium, Flanders, Netherlands area, and also in France. But so, this is a part of history I can't quite entangle, but so, there were the Beguines, and they also had their male counterpart, the Beguines, who, as the books I've read say, they had erotic bonds between them. And so, the Beguines, who this later turned into like the movement of the free spirit, but the Beguines would travel around, these free-spirited men, would travel around, and as it says in Norman Cohen, so after they were deemed heretical, the Beguines and the Beguines kind of formed an invisible underground empire. So the Beguines would travel around and visit communities of Beguines, and as a secret code, the Beguines would say, "The angel of divine word has arrived." It all sounds very exciting, and I'm not exactly sure what they were getting up to in there. So let's dive into this a little bit deeper with the movement of the free spirit. Now, when I keep wanting to say the brethren of the free spirit, some people call it that, but that's looking at just the Beguines, but the movement. So the text from Marguerite, who got burnt, was fundamental in these, and it was composed of Beguines and Beguines. I'm going to just stop talking a sec and look back at my notes. Be back in a sec. So, movement of the free spirit. They preached a kind of like Gnostic illumination, kind of Neoplatonic ideals, again with this divine spark within, kind of like pantheistic ideas of putting the spirit into matter. They believed that authority lay in the kind of subjective personal experience, and therefore the Catholic Church is an obstacle to salvation. They also believed that humans were the pinnacle of perfection and therefore incapable of sinning, which sounds pretty damn radical for the 1300s. And wait, there is more. There is more. So, like many people who went against the Catholic Church, they were charged with promiscuous, blasphemous activities. But actually, in this case, it seems to be true. So they were like promiscuous, free-loving heretics, really. They saw sex, or the sexual act, as they referred to it as the delight of paradise, and a way to ecstatically ascend to mystical ecstasy. And then I just read now, very funny, so apparently in in Cologne, in the 14th century, I'm going to say, anyway, they had a naked mass, blooming naked mass. They said that it would, they got to the state of Adam and Eve before the fall. Look how excited I am by this idea. Middle-aged naked mass. But of course, as his history goes, they got burnt for their naked mass. Blooming Catholic Church. Also, like this free spirit movement, again, let's not romanticize all the heretical sects. So they were a little bit more elitist than some of the other groups who had, like, you know, the, I don't want to say peasants, lower classes were part of them, but not the brethren of, or the movement of the free spirit. They were more like merchants and the kind of middle classes, and they divided society between those who are crude in spirit and those who are subtle in spirit, and of course they class themselves as those who are subtle in spirit. So that is the movement of the free spirit, who I think the Beguines, then, they are my favourite. It does speak to this kind of like mystical anarchic practices, although they were kind of like middle classes. Now we're slowly getting to the witches. As I said, and this is what I've been chatting on for ages, but we're looking at the overlap between heresy and witchcraft. And these groups are interesting because women were at the forefront of them. And the next ones we're going to talk about are the Cathars and the Waldenses. Let's go. Hello everyone, it's me again. Some time has passed since we last spoke. I think I'm going to continue next week because I need to do more research. Oh, when we start talking about like the Valdensians, I think that's how you say it. This is when the witchery starts to come in, which I know that's what you're waiting for. And I don't want to fluff it up. Look, I've got all my blooming researches out, things all over the floor. But it's starting to get dark, so maybe it would be good if I speak in the dark, but my lighting situation isn't the best. So we'll stop at the Brethren of the Free Spirit and we'll continue with our exploration later.